Alright, what's going on everyone? Today I'm going to show you how to upgrade the Faerie Pranks starter deck. So if you want to upgrade these, you need to go to the starter decks tab. You can't edit this, but you can clone it down here. And this is going to create a copy in your decks, which you can now edit as much as you want. The first thing you want to do is you either want to click here if you're in this windowed mode, or click up here. And we want to switch this over to standard because of course it defaults to alchemy. So this deck is very simple. This is just a tribal fairy deck. You can just do this and we can see that it's tribal fairies. So the problem with fairies on a budget and even fairies on a non-budget is there aren't that many fairies. There are not even that many sets that have them. And there's not really a ton of fairies to fill the deck out. So this is very similar to like Dimir rogues, where it's sort of like a tempo blue control type of deck first with fairies as a finisher kind of. And fairies do have some very powerful control spells like fairy fencing and spell stutter, so we'll be adding those. I mean, it's common and uncommon. So let's start by taking out what I think might be one of the worst fairies, which is Borrow Naughty, and replacing it with one of the best fairies, which is Obraya. So this is it's a 2-mana 1/3 flying. It has a lifelink, typically, if we have another fairy, which we usually will. And you can pay 3 mana to give it +1/+0. So, it's just not very good. This, on the other hand, 2 mana 2/2, already better. Flash, flying. Flash is always relevant because it allows you to hold up your counter spells. On turn 2, you can hold up your counter spell, not play this. And if the opponent plays something scary that could end your game, you counter it. And if they don't play anything threatening, then you play this. That's why Flash is so important in tempo decks like Dimir Rogues and Spirits and Pioneer, right? So we'll just take 2 of these out and we'll add 2 more of these because they're very good. Next, I want to take out another pretty medium fairy in the form of Spellsworn Coven. And I want to add a Halo Forager, which is one of my favorite, like kind of underrated fairies. I feel like people just don't give this card enough credit. I think it's very good. So it's a 2-for-1. It can bounce something, which doesn't technically 2-for-1 permanently, and then it's a 4 mana 2/3 flyer that when it enters, the opponent discards. So you could, like in the late game, if the opponent has no cards, you could bounce something, then play this and make them discard it, which is pretty good if you have 7 mana in the late game for a 2/3, but this is much better in my opinion. So it's a 3 mana 3 power flyer. Awesome. When it enters, you can pay X, and when you do, you can cast an instant or sorcery card with mana value X from your graveyard without paying its mana cost, which you do pay the mana cost because you have to pay the X, right? But you could pay 4 for this and recast this. You don't have to pay anything for X because typically it's going to be 1 black mana to give something -3/-3. And we're going to be adding more of these. We're also going to be adding we're going to be adding more spells, much better spells. We're going to be taking out some of the clunky stuff. But yeah, like this sort of 2-for-1s, there's really specific scenarios where it's crazy good, again, in the late game, when you have 7 mana, when the opponent happens to have no cards in hand. But generally, I mean, this is just amazing. 3 mana, 3 power flyer, recast a removal spell or a card draw spell is pretty good. So let's take these 2 out. Let's add these 2 to the deck. Next, we have a rare in the deck that I don't know why it's in the deck, but we have Drag the Canal. It is, it's okay. 2 mana. You can make a 2/2 fine. If a creature died this turn, so if we play a removal spell or something, we get to gain 2, surveil 2, then investigate, which is all pretty good. I think this is actually pretty solid in like a blue-black control deck, but I don't know if it's good enough for this. And we have a good fairy that's similar in its card advantage, and that's a Picklock Prankster, which for 2 mana can mill 4, then put an instant or sorcery or fairy card from among them into our hand. And then it's not a powerful fairy, but it's a 1/3 flying vigilance for 2. And the cool thing about this is it fills our graveyard, so we have more stuff to cast with this, right? Which is pretty good. We're also going to be having more of these in the deck, which are relevant in the graveyard. If we mill over them, we get to draw a card with it. So this card's pretty good. It's played in Pioneer and like Arclight Phoenix and stuff, and I think it's fine enough right here as well. I think it's worth taking this out for a 3rd one of these for our tribal fairy deck. Next, I want to take out Freeze in Place. So this is, okay, 2 mana, you tap a creature, then put 3 stun counters on it, and then scry 2. So this deals with a creature for 3 turns, which is pretty good, and the scrying is nice, but you know what's better than getting rid of a creature for 3 turns it's getting rid of a creature permanently, which is what Faerie Fencing can do very easily. So it's give something -X for X for an X and 1 spell, but it gets an extra -3/-3 if we control a fairy. So this is basically 1 mana to give something -3/-3, 2 mana to give something -4/-4, 3 mana gives something -5/-5, which is going to kill most of the things in the format. Kill Shieldred, for example, which is one of the bigger threats. So yeah, it just works really well, and it's so nice that we can usually play it in the early game for just 1 mana against like aggro decks and stuff. So yeah, I'd rather take these out and get a full 4 copies of these. These are played in basically every fairy deck ever. If you see a tribal fairy deck, it's usually going to be playing 3 to 4 of these and 3 to 4 of these, just because they're so good in fairy decks, which is why we're going to take out Faerie Slumber Party for a spell stutter. We've taken out 2 rares, but the rares are just, I don't know why they didn't give us more fairy rares, to be honest. I mean, wait, actually, are there fairy rares that aren't in the deck? That's actually a good question, isn't it? Maybe they just gave us all the rare fairies. I didn't actually check. They could have given us a Fairy Mastermind. That would have been so much better. Anyway, so this rare is fine. 6 mana, returns all creatures, and then for each opponent who controlled a creature, you get to put 2 1/1 blue fairies. So the idea is we want to bounce our opponent's board and then get a couple 1/1 flyers, which is fine. For 6 mana, it's a lot. I feel like we're in black. We could probably play better board wipes. I mean, it does bounce our stuff. We could combo off with this a bit, right? We could like bounce our board, then play a bunch of fairies and drain the opponent, I guess. So that's cool, but why not play like the best counter spell? It's 2 mana, it counters a spell unless its controller pays 2 + 1 for each fairy we control, right? So it's usually like counter a spell unless they pay like 4 or something, right? So it's really good. So we're going to take one of these out, I'm going to add one of these in, and I can say that you could play around with these ratios. You could play 4 of these and 3 of these. The reason I think Faerie Fencing is better right now is because with Bloom Burrow, the format is hyper aggressive. There are so many aggressive creature-based decks that I think having 1 more creature removal spell and 1 less counter spell is more important. Next, I think these quick studies are a little clunky. They're okay. They can be reduced with this card, which isn't a very good fairy. We're going to be taking out at least 1 of them. A 3 mana to draw 2 is basically, for the entire history of the game, has been just okay. It's never been exceptional. So I think it's worth taking out 1 for our 4th copy of Sleight of Hand, which for 1 mana, looks at the top 2, puts 1 of them into our hand. This is basically, you know, it's the best option we have as a replacement for Consider, which I can't even look at because I can't even look at it right now. Anyway, Consider. I'll put it on screen. This card. We can't play it anymore. It's not in Standard. So we have Sleight of Hand. So we'll take out 1 of these. We'll add a 4th copy of this. And that's pretty good. We're going to keep this here because we're going to take 1 more out for 1 Deduce. Deduce is another heavily played card draw spell. 2 mana to draw is terrible, but it also investigates so you can draw again later. So technically, this draws 2 cards for 3. This draws 2 cards for 4. It's more expensive, but you know, you can cast this end of turn, still play stuff, and then you can draw your 2nd card from your clue later. So it's a little bit more optimal, a little bit more efficient, even if it's technically more expensive. Could probably take both of these out for 2 more of these. In my case, I think this is fine for now. So next, I think this card is a little bit clunky. 3 mana, 2/1 flyer. It does give instants and sorceries -1 cost. The problem is we have so many 1-drops. It doesn't affect these at all. It makes this a little bit easier to cast. Like I can split these up. So here are our spells. This does reduce the cost of these, but it's just not as impactful as I would want. So I want to take 1 of these out for a Fairy Dream Thief. And I could potentially take all 3 of these out for 3 of these. I was debating it, but when it enters, we surveil 1. So not only is this more filtering, but also we can put stuff in our graveyard if we have 1 of these in hand. But also, if it's in our graveyard, we can pay 3, exile it to draw and lose 1 life. So that's going to be great if we mill over it. But also, if it just dies, if we chump block with it, it redraws, right? Which is pretty cool. Very nice in the late game. So I think I'm going to take out 1 of these for 1 of these. And also, I do think it's worth taking out this last quick study. Because again, it's 3 mana to draw 2. This is, once it's in the graveyard, 3 mana to draw 1, but it also surveils and it's a creature that's going to trigger this and stuff, right? And it's another flying threat. We're a fairy deck. We want to play flyers and attack the opponent. So I think it's worth taking out this for a third copy of this. And now we have a few more fairies. Here's our fairy count now. It's not bad. The ratio of things is a lot better. However, there are a lot of rare fairies that we can't add. Some of them are already in the deck. Those would include Sleep Cursed Fairy and Italian's Messenger. These two are fantastic. This is a 1-mana 3/3. It enters with stun counters on it, so it can't technically attack or anything until like turn 4. But you can dump mana into it to untap it earlier. If it has stun counters on it, you can pay 2 to untap it. It's just going to remove a stun counter. The 2 mana untap it is basically 2 mana remove a stun counter. This is awesome. 3 mana 1/3 flying when you attack with one or more fairies. It doesn't even have to be this. You draw a card, you discard a card, which can help with the graveyard for this. And when you discard a card, you put a counter on a fairy. So it filters, and it makes stuff bigger, which is very relevant because, you know, we're all flying, right? I mean, if this thing starts soaking up counters, it becomes very deadly. It's already pretty good. 3 mana 3 power flyer can be pretty aggressive if the opponent doesn't have an answer for it. There's also Fairy Mastermind, which we looked at earlier. This card is very awesome. So this is a 2 mana 2/1 flash flying. Again, flash, very great. It allows us to hold up our counter spells and we can flash it in end of turn. But also when the opponent draws their second card, we draw a card. So between this and Italian's Messenger, these add a lot of card draw and filtering. So I think what you can do if you want to add these, the weakest fairies right now are probably Mocking Sprite. It just doesn't do too much for us. And probably this one, it's okay. It's a 1 mana 1/1 flyer. And on turn 3, if we play it, we can tap something and add a stun counter, which is fine. But these are so good. So we could take these and add Italian's Messenger and Fairy Mastermind. These are the two really good card draw things, right? And if we add these, we have more card draw. It makes Deduce and Sleight of Hand less necessary. And that would make room for another card that I wanted to talk about, which is Ego Drain. So this, target opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-land and they discard it. That is crazy good. The problem is, if you don't control a fairy, you also have to discard, and it exiles. So this is played like in every fairy deck. It's so good. It's basically Thoughtseize, but better, sort of, in this deck. The only problem is you can't play it on turn 1, because turn 1 you don't have a fairy. But after turn 1, after you have a fairy in play, like on turn 3, this becomes so good. It's also so easy to recast with Halo Forager. The problem is, the only way to fit it in is to take out all the card draw, and I don't think I'm comfortable with that right now. I think we need the card draw since our fairy quality is so low, right? We don't have any of the all these good rare fairies. So I think what I would do as the upgrade path for this is I would be taking out these lower quality fairies. I'd be adding these card draw fairies, these card filtering, especially the Messenger, but this as well. If you can fit any of these card draw fairies in, for each one you add, you could take out a card draw spell for an Ego Drain as well, right? You're basically replacing the need to filter by adding more ways to filter. And since you don't need this as much afterwards, you can start adding Ego Drains. These are uncommon. I just don't know if I want to add them with our, like, I feel like this card filtering stuff is necessary with how many fairies we have. So that would be my plan. Get Italian's Messenger in, get Fairy Mastermind in, then start taking out some of this card draw stuff for Ego Drain. So yeah, that's the idea. But for now, let me make sure I get the right cards out. This is our deck, and I think it's definitely much better than we started with. It is still a budget 0 rare fairy deck, and these rare fairies are so powerful. It's just necessary, man. I would really want to get more of these. But for now, it's pretty good. Thanks for watching, everyone. Hope that was useful, and I will see you in the next one.